Let's talk about where in the cell respiration happens. So this is our respiration map, or the map of where carbohydrate metabolism takes place. Now, I've drawn a cell here with a nucleus and a rather large mitochondria because, as you know from studying the cell, mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, and this is where the majority of ATP synthesis takes place. But the first thing that we have to do is we have to get our source of energy, and that is glucose. Glucose has to be transported into the cell. And so I've drawn a transporter here to bring glucose in. Now, we discussed in membrane transport some of the difficulty the cell faces in terms of bringing things into the cell, bringing things down or up a concentration gradient. So here, the cell does something rather clever in order to make sure that it can keep getting glucose in. After it brings the glucose into the cell, it attaches a phosphate group to it. This is known as glucose 6-phosphate, so it's not actually glucose anymore, which means that the cell thinks that there is no glucose here, and it can continue bringing in plain glucose without the phosphates. As soon as they come in, they attach a phosphate, and now it's not glucose anymore. So it doesn't mess up the concentration gradient and allows the cell to continue bringing in glucose. We say that this is the way the cell maintains a favorable inward gradient for glucose. Now, this glucose then goes through a process known as glycolysis. Glyco refers to the glucose, and lysis means to break. This takes place inside the cell, and the result is two molecules of what we call pyruvic acid, or you may sometimes see this referred to as pyruvate. So the pyruvic acid, this first pathway, the glycolysis, forms pyruvic acid, also forms some ATP, and we'll talk about how it does that in the NADH. But now the pyruvic acid still has some energy in it, in those bonds between the carbon molecules. And the pyruvic acid will next go into the matrix of the mitochondria for what we call the matrix reactions. So I'm going to write, I'm going to write matrix here, because that's the next stage of the reactions. In the matrix, the pyruvic acid is converted to carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide leaves or diffuses out of the mitochondria and out of the cell, and eventually is what we breathe out. After the matrix reactions, the mitochondria does what are called membrane reactions. And these are done by proteins that are in this inner membrane of the mitochondria. So these are called the membrane reactions. And this is where the bulk of the ATP is formed during cellular respiration. Now, it's not obvious from looking at this yet, but you've probably wondered why it's called respiration. And the reason is that mitochondria use oxygen to complete these steps, to complete these reactions. So they use oxygen and they form CO2. Well, the whole reason that we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out CO2 is to support this process. The oxygen that you breathe in is going to your mitochondria so that they can make ATP. And the CO2 that you breathe out is the result of the ATP that was made.